Okay, good morning everyone, and can I welcome to the 13th meeting of 2020 of Scotland's Social Security Committee. We've got one apology this morning. Alison Johnson, MSP, unfortunately cannot be with us, and she was replaced by John Finney, MSP, this morning. Our Deputy Convener, Paula McNeill, will be with us, but she's running a bit late, so hopefully she'll join us as soon as she can. And we will now move to agenda item 1, which is declaration of interest. Can I welcome Mr Finney to the committee? You're more than welcome. Can I ask you whether you have got any appropriate interest to declare at this point?
Good morning, and thank you very much indeed, Convener. I have no interest to declare, thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. And we now move to agenda item 2, which is decision to take an item in private. The committee has asked you to agree that item 3, consideration of evidence heard at today's meeting, is taken in private. Given the complexities of a group discussion over video conferencing, I'm assuming everyone agrees unless you indicate otherwise. So can I ask, well, I'm not asking whether you agreed, does anyone disagree with that? Okay, thank you. So we move to agenda item 3, which is assessing the feasibility of citizens' basic income pilots in Scotland. The committee will take evidence on the draft final report, Scottish Citizens' Basic Income Feasibility Study, and can I welcome Neil Craig, Acting Team Head, Evaluation Public Health Scotland, and Andy White, Senior Officer, Welfare Rights and Money Advice, Glasgow City Health and Social Care Partnership and Glasgow City Council, and Julie McLachlan, Senior Manager, Economic Policy, North Ayrshire Council. You're all very welcome, and at the start, I thank you all very much for your hard work in relation to this report, and I believe Julie may have an open statement for the committee before we move to questions.
Okay, firstly I'd like to thank the committee for the invitation to speak to you today about the findings of our final feasibility study report. This builds on the previous session that we had with the committee, which coincided with the release of our interim report in November. The committee will be aware that we published the final report of the feasibility study in June. This is a substantial and in-depth piece of research, and the steering group were delighted that all 4 local authorities involved in the project formally endorsed the report ahead of its submission to the Scottish Government. Just to remind the committee, the steering group who led the work of this feasibility study have been working in partnership since 2017 on this project. The 4 local authorities involved are Glasgow, Edinburgh, Fife and my own council, North Ayrshire Council, and also in collaboration with Public Health Scotland, formerly NHS Health Scotland. The project has been supported by the Scottish Government and also the Improvement Service. The Scottish Government supported the project with funding, which was announced in the 2017 Programme for Government, and in addition to this, each of the partners provided in-kind resource as well to allow the feasibility study to take place over 2 years. Just in terms of the content of the feasibility study, we set out a proposed model for piloting a basic income in Scotland. We also explored the feasibility in terms of legislative feasibility, financial, and also the practical implications of being able to pilot a basic income, as well as looking at potential costs and benefits. We commissioned 2 pieces of novel research, which we can say a bit more about. First of those was around the social security implications of a basic income, and the second was around the economic modelling of a national rollout of a basic income. In terms of the conclusions of the feasibility study, the steering group recommends that a pilot study of basic income is undertaken in Scotland. We believe that this would add a great deal of detail and missing information to the debate over the feasibility of a basic income. In particular, it would allow us to test and evaluate the impact that a basic income would have on communities in Scotland, and it would generate improved evidence around the impact, in particular on a person's behaviour. There's never been a pilot that we can compare to in a Scottish context, and it would also allow us to test how you would implement the policy and also stimulate policy debate and community and public debate around the feasibility and the desirability of a basic income. However, whilst it is desirable, so whilst we would be recommending that you pilot a citizens' basic income, it's currently not feasible. There are substantial institutional challenges to do with implementing a pilot, and the research has determined that it's not feasible for any one level of government to implement the pilot without collaboration. So in short, what this means is that a CBI pilot would require the full support across all levels of government, local, Scottish, UK, including the Department of Work and Pensions and HMRC as well. We do hope that the findings of the feasibility study contribute to a wider discussion around Scottish society and also a wellbeing economy in Scotland. Thank you.
Julie McGlaughlin, I'm going to thank you for that opening statement, and as I said initially, thank you to the team for all your work. And I'm grateful you put on record this is a long-standing piece of work. There's been much made about a citizens' basic income in recent months as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we might get there with questions. That's not the question I'm going to ask, but I think it's important to put on the record this study is not a reaction to that, but is actually a bit of an ongoing commitment from Scottish local government and Scottish government to see how that could work. Now, I'd like to look a little bit at the case for a pilot, and the other members will talk about the barriers to a pilot, I am absolutely sure, in questioning, but I would like to look at the case for a pilot. And I've read the report. It's quite good to kind of bring to life what a pilot might look like, because that means more to MSPs. So I saw one of the reasons why there's been institutional resistance to a citizen's basic income has been that most social security systems are wed to a kind of conditionality model, whether that's sanctions or other conditions put on claimants, and moving away from that structural resistance to moving away from that model, which brings me to think about how a pilot might work in practice. So, for example, Postle Park and Rockhill in my constituency, between them has about 10,000, 11,000 residents there. It's fair to say that sanctions and conditionality has been a significant issue for them, and it certainly had a significant impact on the communities there that I represent. So when you're looking at the case for a pilot scheme, it's because of social security being wed to a sanctions-based regime. So are those the kind of what kind of areas that you would be looking to do? Clearly not necessarily my constituency, I would say that is the local MSP, but are you looking to see the potential benefits to areas of particular deprivation that perhaps the current system simply doesn't work for?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm happy to take that question. Thank you, convener. And I'm sure that other colleagues, Andy White and Neil Craig, might have something to add as well. But just to summarise the model that we are proposing, so we're proposing a randomised control study. There would be 2 study areas which would be generalisable to the Scottish population. One of those areas would receive what we classify as a low payment, which would be £73 a week for an adult, and the other would receive a high payment, which would be £213 a week. And this coincides with a minimum income standard, which GRF, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, propose would be an acceptable amount of money for someone to live on, but also to be able to fully participate in society. For us, it's really important that the pilot model covers the 5 key principles of basic income. And when you look elsewhere around the globe, not all models that have been piloted are able to represent all of these key principles. So principles that we propose are that it's universal, that it's paid to all within that pilot area, that it would be unconditional. So you mentioned conditionality. We would propose that there wouldn't be conditions attached. So, for example, participants wouldn't be required to search for work. It would be individual, so it wouldn't be paid to households. It would be paid to the individual. They paid at regular intervals and as a cash payment, so for example a bank transfer. As I've mentioned, we would look to test the two levels, and really the interest in testing the low level of a CBI, £73 per week, would be to test the impact of removing that conditionality. We'd also propose that there would be a suspension of a range of existing income-related benefits. My colleague Andy White can provide more detail on that, whilst other benefits such as disability, childcare, housing would continue. We would propose that the pilot would run for 3 years with an additional 1 year preparatory period, and we can say a bit more about the reasons behind the duration of that. In terms of sample sizes, we do give an indication of a size of a pilot. We would propose that in order for the results to be generalisable, that for the low payment of a basic income, there would be 2,500 participants in an area, and for the high payment, there would be 14,000 participants, and this would cost approximately £186 million for the 3-year study, including both of the low and high levels of a CBI. In particular, on your point around conditionality, this has been one of the difficulties for other pilots. They haven't been able to test the impact of an unconditional CBI. We can say a bit more about the engagement that has taken place with EWP and HMRC, and also the findings that we've had from that engagement as well.
Please do just keep your powder dry in relation to telling us about that engagement, because I know other members do want to ask specific questions about that. But I'm taking it from the last point you made, Julie, that one of the cases for a pilot would be to analyse the impact on how people get themselves back into the job market and seek employment. When you remove conditionality, that would be a positive thing to study. I don't put words in your mouth, but other folk won't see us on nodding head there, Julie McLaughlin, when you said that. I don't know if you want to comment further on that.
Yeah, the report sets out the 3 areas that we would be most interested in exploring. So you mentioned the labour market there. So the 3 areas would be the impact that it would have on poverty, child poverty and unemployment. So those are the 3 primary incomes that we would be interested in exploring. There are also secondary incomes that we would be interested in exploring, including experience of the social security system, health and wellbeing, and so on. If I could just say a note on why it is that we're looking that we would be looking to focus on those outcomes in particular. All 4 local authorities, as you would expect, suffer from high rates of poverty and inequality. So for my own council, for example, 1 in 3 children live in poverty. There's only 1 job for every 2 people. So we've all looked at things like fairness commissions, poverty commissions. So we would be really keen to explore the impact on poverty. One of the reasons, in part, for testing the impact on employment is that a lot of other pilots have sought just to test the impact on employment. If you look at the Finnish pilot, which concluded recently, and the final results of that, a lot of people who argue against basic income say that it would have a negative impact on labour market participation. Actually, the pilot in Finland found that there was a slightly positive impact on labour market participation, and even more important than that, there was a positive impact on health and wellbeing as well.
That's very helpful. I've got one final question before I bring other members in. You'll appreciate why I mentioned Postle Park previously, because it's supporting people into the labour market rather than them living in fear of sanction, which is a reality for too many of the households that I represent. But that connection with supporting people to have enough money to live on, and also supporting them in the labour market and what that looks like. The report gives reference to the changing nature of employment and the development of a gig economy, uncertain work, transient employment, short-term employment, a lot more uncertainty with the types of jobs that are being created, and a lot of stigma around those jobs also. From time to time, are you keen to look in any pilot about whether or not it changes the perception of those seeking employment to maybe look at types of employment they otherwise wouldn't have thought was worth their while to carry out, or they couldn't make ends meet, or they were worried that the impact on their benefits if they were to try a job that may only last a few months and they found themselves unemployed again. So could you say maybe a little bit more about how the changing nature of employment might actually be something to look at in any pilot as well, to see if the citizen basic income can support communities to look again at certain jobs that perhaps don't work for them?
Yeah, I think my colleague Neil Craig would probably like to add some areas in terms of the evaluation of a pilot and the areas in particular that we would like to focus on. One of the things that we do highlight within the report and the arguments for a basic income is, as you've highlighted, is the changing nature of the labour market. And that's an area that the RSA are really keen on exploring as well. And I know that one area that the committee would be keen to explore is the impact of COVID-19 on the case for a basic income. And as you can see, with the redundancies that are being announced, that strengthens the case for a basic income as well, and an insecure labour market. I think part of the issue, particularly in places like North Ayrshire, although of course we look at the wider local areas as well, is that there just are not enough jobs. There's a greater focus now on fair work, fairly paid jobs, and concepts like community wealth building and a wellbeing economy. But I think my colleague Neil Craig can add more around the specific outcomes that we would like to explore, and importantly how we would go about finding out if the pilot had achieved those outcomes as well.
Julie, thank you very much for that. Neil, before I bring you in, just to give broadcasting a heads up, once you just make your comments on this, we'll move to Shona Robertson, MSP, for the next question. Neil.
Yeah, so just briefly to add to what Julie's saying, I think what we're proposing in the any pilot study is that it should be a mixed evaluation, both looking at quantitative measures like that Julie's listed, like impacts on poverty, child poverty, unemployment. But we'd also be wanting to explore a whole range of other outcomes, like the mechanisms that affect the choices people make about whether they go to work, whether they actually take the opportunity offered by a basic income to do things like additional training or additional volunteering, and to explore that through what we would call a process evaluation, where we dig a bit deeper into the circumstances of individuals and explore them using what we would call qualitative methods, so interviews or focus groups, really to get to the bottom of the sorts of motivations people have when they have the access to a basic income, and how that begins to affect the sorts of choices they make. So we absolutely would want to combine that mixture of quantitative, like hard measures of employment, poverty, etc., with a more sort of nuanced understanding of the rationale for the choices people would make when they were offered a basic income.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Neil Craig. Shona Robertson, MSP.
Hi there, good morning, and thank you for all the work that you've done to date. It's become, I guess you must have felt that it's become very much centre stage during the discussions of the COVID response, which is, I think, a very positive thing that's gathering so much support as a concept. But on a couple of occasions, Julie McLachlan particularly has mentioned the institutional challenges of being able to deliver a pilot under the current arrangements that we have, particularly in relation to the DWP and HMRC. So I'd like to explore that a little bit more. First of all, you could tell us whether there has been any progress made in talks with both of those organisations, and what the range of legislative, technical and delivery changes that would be needed to join up the dots around what is a very complex system to make sure that a pilot could work to its full extent that it would need to in order to gather the data that you would want to gather.
Julie McLachlan.
Okay, yeah, thank you for your question. So just to give a brief overview of the relationship with DWP and HMRC, because as you've alluded to, that was a key part of the feasibility study, was exploring those institutional arrangements. So the steering group has been engaging with DWP since April 2018, just before the formal start of the feasibility study. I know that the former Cabinet Secretary for Communities had written to the then Secretary of State for DWP to asking them to engage with the local authorities throughout the feasibility study. So that letter was in May 2018. And following on from that, the current Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government wrote to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions and also the Financial Secretary to the Treasury to seek assurance that the DWP officials would continue to engage with the steering group. So we have had progress in that engagement. We've had 2 face-to-face meetings with DWP and HMRC. The first of those took place in March 2019, and the second of those took place more recently in January 2019. I think it's fair to say that the engagement moved at a slower pace than we would have liked, given the tight timescales that we were working to for the feasibility study. And it has been difficult to get some substantive answers to the questions that we've posed to DWP. Some of this is due to the complexity of the benefit system. Some of this is due to their focus on the current welfare system as well. I have to say that officials of both organisations have been helpful and have engaged in our areas of interest. Just to say a bit more about the latter engagement that took place, we presented to them our preferred model of a CBI building on the interim report which we set out, and we put questions to both organisations on our specific areas of interest that we would need to explore further to determine our conclusions from the feasibility study. These covered, for example, conditionality, which has already been raised, the treatment of CBI payments, suspension of benefits, transitioning back onto benefits, and any local variations that could be allowed in terms of piloting or tax changes. I think it's fair to say that a focus of this from our perspective has been to ensure that there is no detriment to any potential pilot participants. We weren't able to identify a delivery model for a CBI currently as it's set out within the full report. I think a key issue is the need for primary legislation to be able to remove conditionality or to suspend benefits. These issues wouldn't go away if you had a smaller pilot. So if you had a pilot focusing on a smaller amount of people, you would still have the issues with the interaction with the benefit system and a need for that primary and secondary legislation change to be able to remove conditionality, for example, from a certain pilot area. I think what these meetings have highlighted is that to be able to pilot a basic income and to pilot the model that we propose, there has to be further detailed technical discussions to fully map these benefit and tax interactions with the purpose of ensuring that there would be no detriment. A further issue, which we can, my colleague Andy White can expand on, would be how a basic income would interact with the complex range of entitlements that those of a pension age currently receive. So this requires careful consideration as well. I understand that the Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government, since receiving our final feasibility study report, has written to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions and also the Financial Secretary to the Treasury to highlight the findings and ask for further dialogue on the potential of a CBI pilot. The steering group and the 4 councils would be really keen that this dialogue took place.
Andy White, did you want to add? You were mentioned there?
Yes, happy to to comment. I think as Julie's detailed, there was engagement with the DWP, and I think there's no doubt about it. We would probably have wanted further engagement with the DWP and HMRC. However, it's fair to say that when we did engage with them, it was a very constructive meeting. There's something like 18 representatives from the HMRC and DWP present, so they were certainly taking the issue seriously. You'll see from our recommendations that we recommend that there's further detailed work done in relation to how a CBI would interact with the benefits system, particularly the UK benefits system. And when we got feedback on the model from the DWP, it was very helpful in setting out the legislative challenges, but also it highlighted the issues within the DWP and HMRC about the system changes that would be required and the barriers in relation to IT systems. So really, from the meeting, I really had a feeling that I wanted to go again in relation to further discussions with the DWP and the HMRC. And if we are looking to have a CBI pilot in Scotland, and one that makes sure that those in lowest incomes, particularly on benefit, are not put in detriment, it's really important that there's further work to map out the potential detriments and the solutions to those detriments. And it would probably lead us to suggest perhaps a different model from the one that we have, but in relation to the timescales that the steering group are working to, we've made comment about the model that we did propose and the rationale behind that, but there's no doubt about it. There has to be more detailed work before a pilot could be launched in any part of Scotland.
Julie Robertson?
Yeah, so from what you're saying, it sounds to me, and if I'm hoping I'm capturing this correctly, that there's been pretty good engagement with HMRC and DWP at official level. Whether or not there's been the same response at ministerial level, I think is maybe reasonable to the letters that the Cabinet Secretary has said. But leaving that aside, how optimistic are you that there will be further engagement around some of the detail? And maybe a more tricky question, I mean, will that reach a point where to go further than that engagement would require more political agreement from the UK government itself? Do you get that sense? And are there any further meetings planned at the moment at official level that to build on some of the work that's been done?
Julie McLachlan?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I'll take the latter part of that first. So no, there aren't any further meetings planned. The final report concluded the end of the feasibility study and the formal funding that was available for that, and the in-kind funding that was available for that as well. So no further meetings planned. In terms of taking that to the next step, as we've said, to enable us to propose a more detailed way of how you would go about piloting a basic income, we absolutely need to have further engagement across all levels of government, so across local, Scottish and UK. I think it's accurate that DWP officials are very focused on the current model of social security that they're developing, and I know that the Chancellor in debates regarding the COVID response and a citizen's basic income has not suggested that he would be willing to explore that idea further. So I think without a commitment at a political level, we wouldn't be able to explore that further, given the focus is on their response to COVID, but also their response, their focus on the current social security system, rather than looking at the feasibility of piloting. That's not to say if we approached officials that they wouldn't be willing to engage in further dialogue. But I think it's key that for us to take this to the next step and be able to pilot that, we would need further buy-in from at a political level.
Jonah, do you want to come back on that?
Oh, that's fine, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy Val for MSP.
Evidence so far. I wonder if I can just pick up on some of the stuff around what happens, unforeseen circumstances, if a pilot was to take place, particularly those perhaps most vulnerable, disabled people, people who are on low incomes at the moment. What mitigation would you see? So we run a program and we find that actually people who have lost their DLA or their PIP payments are actually less well off or struggling more because of other unforeseen circumstances. How would you mitigate that if the study doesn't work, as have been cases in other parts of the world?
Now, I'm going to witnesses based on who drops a note in the chat box, so just in case other witnesses do want in, but I see Julie McGlaston again has indicated, so thanks Julie, could you respond to that?
Yeah, I can respond to that, and then I would like to bring in my colleague Andy White, who has a more detailed understanding of the welfare system. But what I would like to say is that a key principle of us moving towards a pilot would be no detriment. What we do in the feasibility study report is that we do an indicative quality impact assessment. We would strongly advise, and we set out this in the report, that before moving to pilot, that a full detailed quality impact assessment is undertaken to ensure that there are not any detrimental impacts to particularly those most vulnerable groups which you've outlined, and particularly those on the lowest income as well. The report also sets out some work on transitioning, because what's really important is that when someone then starts to receive a basic income, that they're supported and they're aware. And that's one of the reasons why we highlight that the need for that 1 year preparatory period. A lot of other commentators have just suggested that you just go straight into piloting or straight into national rollout, but we feel like that 1 year preparatory period is really important. Further to that, we also feel that supporting those to transition off a basic income back onto, whether it's benefits or depending on their situation, they might not have received any benefits. So it's really important that people are supported in that transitioning period. But I assume that Andy White will have more to add in terms of benefit interaction and the impact on those receiving benefits.
And Andy White?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that's a good summary from Julie about the careful approach that would be taken to any pilot. With regards to people who are entitled to disability benefits, the member mentioned disability living allowance, but PIP or attendance allowance, or of course the Scottish Government's replacement to disability assistance. We are not saying that those would be replaced by our proposed model of CBI, so there would still be an expectation that those benefits would be accessible by anybody who participated in the pilot. But what we are concerned about in relation to detriment is the potential of a CBI kicking someone out of either a legacy benefit or UC, where because they have a PIP or another disability benefits, they have disability premiums on top of their award of a legacy benefit, or they have transitional protections in relation to disability within universal credit. So we've certainly mapped that out within the report, and I think this would be one of the issues that we would have to do further work with in relation to the DWP, to make sure that if someone was in receipt of a basic income, that it wouldn't kick them out of the kind of wider entitlements that they may have. You'll see from our suggested model that the kind of basic subsistence rates within, for example, universal credit would be suspended to help fund perhaps a a CBI, but we're very keen that that wouldn't then end other entitlements within, for example, you see, disabilities being mentioned, but there, clearly there could be issues in relation to the additional monies for some people in relation to limited capability for work or limited capability for work-related activity, and you'll be aware there's other elements as well. For example, a carer's element too. So these are all kind of issues that we've highlighted within the report about trying to protect people, not put them into to detriment. And we've had initial discussions with the DWP and HMRC about them, but as I've highlighted, it does require further detailed work. We recommend in the report that the Scottish Government and the UK Government should commit to further work in relation to that. And clearly, as a steering group, we would have a continued interest in that kind of work.
Thank you. Jeremy, would you like
I think that's helpful. If I could just come back, Andy, just to clarify this in my own mind, because my understanding was that going forward, if you have a trial program, let's just say it was a great success, and we decided to roll it out across the whole of Scotland or even the whole of the UK, at that point, your disability payments are put in, they go away, they disappear. Or is your argument, or is the model that you're working on, which is obviously different from other parts of the world, is that your disability payments would still continue even if everybody was on a universal income? I think that's helpful for me just to clarify.
Yes, I mean, and I think it's important that this kind of issue is clarified as well, because it's as important to tell people clearly what a CBI would do and what it would replace, but it's also as important to say what it wouldn't replace. So in relation to disability benefits, there is no intention that it would replace that. But as I've said, we want to make sure as well that people would continue to have access to the passporting that the disability benefits takes them to, so that wouldn't be ended too. And that's why the interaction between the CBI and the social security system is so complicated. And some advocates, not all of them, but some of them do suggest that you could just switch off this benefit and switch off that benefit. But as the committee know from the work that they've done over a considerable period, that there are issues in relation to passporting of benefits too. So I think we welcome the opportunity to point out that we're not saying that disability benefits would end, and indeed in the report we just don't say that about disability benefits. We look at it in relation to housing benefit or housing support costs, childcare as well. And as I've said, some of the additional elements we want to see them continue in any system. For example, the top-ups you would get in relation to being a carer, or as I've said, your limited capability for work or work-related activity. So sorry, okay. It's not as straightforward.
No, I mean, I understand it's very complicated.
There's intricacies within that.
Yeah. No, it's not easy, and I think it is helpful. I suppose my final question, Convener, is just around the longer term costing of this. So again, obviously you've put in a figure for the pilot, but going forward, if again this was rolled out in Scotland, the figures have been said it's maybe around 20 to 26 billion pounds for this to be rolled out across the whole of Scotland. Firstly, would you recognise that as a figure? And secondly, would that 20 to 26 billion then be have to add it on in regard to disability benefits? And so what would be the total cost for this scheme to work on an ongoing basis?
I'm not seeing an immediate volunteer in relation to that. I know there are various figures in the paper perhaps you could talk through.
Sorry, yeah, I'll take that. I put my R in the column, but maybe that's not being seen. Yeah, I mean the figures on the long-term rollouts are in the Fraser of Allender report, and so we do recognise that figure that you quoted there. I'm not sure there's much more to say at this stage, other than that figure itself is premised on the same set of assumptions that Andy and Julie have been talking through about what benefits would be replaced and the benefits that would be retained. It also makes assumptions about, for example, the revenue neutrality of the scheme. So we asked Fraser of Allender and their colleagues at Manchester Metropolitan University and the IPPR, we asked them to assume revenue neutrality. So the costs of the scheme had to be covered through savings on the benefits based on the assumptions that we've been talking through, savings on pensions and additional tax revenues and the abolition of the personal tax threshold. So that made the scheme revenue neutral, but that of course was an assumption that had to be built into the modelling. There are alternative ways of financing these things through deficit financing, for example, but the sustainability of that and the long term, the macroeconomic consequences of that, and the number of permutations for how big a level of deficit you might use to fund it, just raised the whole Pandora's box of additional issues that we didn't felt were in the scope of this analysis. So the assumptions we asked Fraser to model are basically the ones Julie and Andy have been talking through: replacement of some benefits, non-replacement of others.
Andy White, do you want to add to that?
I think just to agree with Neil, really. I said I wanted to reply before I heard what he said, which is probably not the wisest. I mean, it really does depend on the model that is settled on. I mean, clearly we suggest that in relation to tackling the issue of poverty, that a minimum income standard, so the higher level there, should be looked at. But probably the cost that comes from that is not in any great extent, because we're given a higher level of money to people who are currently on benefits. It's probably because we're given quite a high level of money to people who are not on benefits and are on higher income. You can see from the cost figures that we've put forward that the suspension of benefit entitlement really doesn't contribute that much to reducing the cost. So therefore, the other side of that is that the majority of the cost is because we're suggesting that quite a high level of payment is made to people who maybe have other levels of income, or certain levels of income that mean they're not having to be in receipt of benefits. So the overall cost really depends on any final model that be taken forward. And I know from your agenda that the cost issues may be something that you're going to look at further. Thanks.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you.
Okay, Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Camilla. I had some questions around the impact of a basic income on people living with a disability. I think it's helpful to have some of those clarified. It was my understanding as well that a basic income would be a replacement for all benefits. So it's helpful to have that clarification that a pilot scheme wouldn't remove disability benefits from the system as well. But I wonder if there was any consideration given to a modelling of a minimum income level which included a rate for disability, so that we did in a model have one streamlined system. We know that people with a disability have higher costs and so would require a higher minimum income to meet the same living standards as someone without a disability. So just to ask whether there was any discussion on including a disability premium in the minimum income modelling that would then include that in the basic income pilot.
Neil Craig.
Yeah. We decided fairly early on in the proceedings that to try and cover the additional costs of those with disabilities would and encapsulate that in a basic income that covered those costs would just lead to a prohibitively expensive basic income for the reason Andy just said, that you're then paying that to people who don't necessarily have those needs on a huge scale. So we felt, on balance, it was better to retain the disability related benefits of the benefit system in the way Andy's just described, and to, if you like, define a basic income that covered just that list of benefits that's in the report that would be replaced. So we didn't go down that route in any detailed way of trying to estimate what the cost of a basic income would be that included those allowances. But Andy might want to add more on that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, just to further comment, I think it is cost prohibitive, but as well as that, we're trying to adhere to the characteristics of a basic income, particularly if we look at the issue of the unconditional nature of it. Now, clearly, any awarding of disability benefits does have an assessment process, and of course the Scottish Government's replacement of the disability benefits has suggested some very helpful and transformational changes to how assessments would take place. But to have a CBI that would also have a process system for deciding if people meet the eligibility criteria for disability benefits, I think would also produce quite a complicated system. So I think it's two issues really. It's about it being cost prohibitive, but it's also about looking at the unconditional nature of a basic income.
I'm just wondering then if there's a danger that a basic income only provides the minimum income requirements for the population without a disability, that people living with a disability then wouldn't see the benefits of meeting a minimum income standard through CBI. They'd be relying on two systems delivering that, and that if they were, as some of us do feel, that the entitlements that people receive for disability aren't enough to cover the costs of living with a disability, that then we have a general population that would meet a minimum income standard, but that for people living with a disability, they would have to rely on another system to deliver that for them, and the danger that they miss out on the benefits of a citizen's basic income.
Anyone want to give some reassurances around disabled people in the benefit system if we move to a citizen's basic income? Andy White.
I mean, I think it's a reasonable point to be made, and I understand, someone who's worked in welfare rights for 20 years in the front line, really looking at maximising benefits and income for disabled people. A system that gets less complicated and is more accessible is to be desired. If you look at our report, and most kind of advocates of basic income, most of them suggest that disability benefits wouldn't be replaced by a basic income, again because cost prohibitive. I mean, for example, if you look at personal independence payment, the enhanced rate of the standard allowance of that is something like, I think it's 89, nearly £90, and that's only one part of it. As you know, you could be entitled to the mobility element too, which has two potential additions in relation to the levels. So if you can imagine trying to get a basic income that also adds on another £90, just in that one example, a week, and apply it to everyone universally, then the cost would be even more than what we are suggesting. And really what we're saying is an acknowledgement of what other advocates are saying, or some of the advocates are saying, is that really what should be done is that the disability benefit system should be reformed and improved, but that would be standalone, separate from any basic income.
Thank you. Just one other question in a different area, just talking about the economic impact of a basic income and how that affects behavioural change, and the ability for someone who receives a minimum income standard to then choose not to accept work which is insecure, choose not to take a job which underpays them for the value of their labour, or is on a 0-hour contract at a minimum income, gives people the ability not to reject unfair work like that. Just whether you feel that the size of I think it was 14,000 participants, whether you would really see the effects of that behavioural change, and whether you'd be able to predict the reaction of employers to that behavioural change, whether they would be forced to amend the type of work that they were offering, the rates of pay and the contractual conditions that they would set in that work.
I see Neil Craig's keen to come in and respond to that. Neil?
Yeah, so those are the very kind of behavioural effects that we're very keen to explore in a pilot. I think it's fair to say that all those potential impacts that you've listed there are the potential impacts that are, if you like, hypothesised for being the result of a basic income. But it's also fair to say that the evidence that we currently have on those potential impacts is quite scanty. So that is precisely why we want to carry out, or would suggest carrying out, a pilot that would explore those sorts of things. A, to find that out, and B, because those sorts of impacts are absolutely integral, if you like, to the macroeconomic modelling, where certain assumptions have had to be made about the likely labour supply response and the productivity effects, because all those things that you've talked about might potentially work through into productivity changes as well. It is to explore those, get better evidence on what those impacts might be. That would also help long term refine some of the assumptions made in the macroeconomic modelling, so that those estimates could be less assumption based and more evidence based. So they're all, if you like, reasonable hypotheses about what might happen, but the evidence base is not great at the moment, and that's partly the rationale for the pilot that's been proposed.
Okay, just briefly, do you think the pilots?
Mark, I'm really sorry. I do need to move on. I also was going to, so my apologies for that, Mr. Griffin. There's a few members still needing to get in. I intend running the meeting to around 11:15, just to give people a heads up, because other members still have to get in. They'll have questions they want to ask. Hence the only reason we have to move on, Mark, I'm afraid. Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. In a slightly different set of questions, this was actually, I think, touched on previously, but it's really just to understand the implications of COVID-19 for arguments around basic income, and I should declare an interest as a co-convener of the cross-party group on basic income. The very manner in which we are conducting this meeting via Blue Jeans would have been, I think, unimaginable for many of us MSPs. Is even a year ago. Now it's become just part of how we do the job, and the changing nature of working practices is not just for MSPs, it's for a range of professions across the private, public and third sector. But given that many of the arguments around basic income have been framed upon potential impacts of, well, the gig economy, the rise of the precariat, but also the implications of mass automation and the fourth industrial revolution, and humans becoming surplus to a lot of the tasks that are normally required. I just wonder, in terms of the implications of COVID-19, that having a fundamental impact on some of the philosophical arguments for basic income.
Julie McLaughlin.
Yeah, thanks for your question. It's an interesting point, and as the committee will be aware, there has been a rise in calls for an emergency UBI. I think we're keen to state that what we are proposing is a pilot of a basic income, not a national rollout of a basic income. An emergency UBI would be a national rollout of our basic income. I think the arguments for a basic income have been enhanced over the previous months. One of those reasons is due to the fact that despite the patchwork of support that's been put in place by various governments, different levels of governments, that people are still falling through the cracks and unable to receive support. So from that perspective, the universal approach of a basic income is of course of appeal, but I'm keen to stress that a national rollout of a BBI is not what we explored. However, the economic modelling findings clearly point to what the economic implications would be of a national rollout. I also think what COVID-19 has done in terms of economic policy has opened up a wider debate around what type of economy do we want, and whether things like GDP should be the key focus in terms of our outcomes, or should we move to a wider range of measures that focus on the wider social, economic and environmental well-being of our communities and society. So I think that has been important. I think as we see future changes in society, so automation has been mentioned, clearly the climate emergency as well, and ensuring a just transition as well. All of these changes in the economy and in economic policy are likely to add to the arguments for a universal basic income. I think we would be keen, due to the issues that are highlighted within the report, that it's important to pilot this first, because we've highlighted the substantial challenges of the interaction with benefits, of the risk that people lose out, the risk of people being negatively having a detriment to their welfare. So we would be keen that before moving to a rollout, that there should be a pilot to better explore particularly the behavioural implications and the risk of detriment as well. But I know there are others, and I should say that we are not proponents of UBI. We've taken a very objective and evidence-based approach to this feasibility study, but I know that other proponents might be keen to just move to a full rollout, and that argument has been made in other areas. But I understand that Andy White might want to add to what I've said there.
Just general agreement with Julie, although I would say that as far as Glasgow City Council are concerned, the COVID and the issues arising from COVID, the financial pressures that people were put under, is certainly one of the reasons that we want to fully explore a CBI. You'll see from the report that our City Treasurer in Glasgow has a foreword, and he's clear that COVID is an issue, and highlights the need for a different model of social protection, one that's there when you actually need it, and a kind of a system that values kind of varied contributions. I'd also say, though, that during COVID, one of my jobs was to coordinate advice to people financial and welfare advice to people who were shielding because of COVID. And I spoke to hundreds of people, and day in and day out, it was clear that the existing system wasn't really up to the job as far as their immediate needs were concerned. I spoke to people who had never claimed benefits in their life before. I spoke to people who were absolutely surprised at the bureaucracy of claiming benefit, and equally astonished at the low levels of support that were there. And I spoke to a whole range of people who were actually managing their crisis through COVID by going into debt, and they were pretty astonished that, as far as the universal credit system is concerned, that to get an immediate payment, they were being asked to go into even more debt. So certainly, for me and for my council, I think there is no doubt that COVID has fueled our interest in a CBI pilot, and the need for a better, more responsive system of social protection.
Thank you very much for this. I would love to go into far more detail, but I have the opportunity via the cross-party group and basic income to go and have these conversations, and I look forward to catching up in the future. But to give colleagues an opportunity to ask questions, I'll stop there, Convener. I appreciate your push for time.
Tom, I appreciate that, and I think we can see the thirst within the committee to get into a conversation about this rather than necessarily a scrutiny session, hence why it's taken so long, and I'm loath to cut members off. We're Deputy Convener Pauline McNeill now.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Tom, for that. I wondered if you could comment on this. So Andy White said there that the existing system's it's not up to the job, and I would agree with that. There's a lot of interest in the idea of a universal or citizens' basic income. But I think it was Neil that said earlier that based on the Fraser of Allender figures, that it was based on a neutrality principle. I think there's a few challenges there, and I'd just like a comment on it. It's hard to test this in a pilot because the whole system cannot run unless there's buy-in, which Julie said earlier on, and I just wondered, are we going to get that buy-in if even based on the lower levels would involve, you say it's revenue neutral, but it isn't really, because in order to achieve it, there would be an increase in tax, a minimum of 8% that people would have to agree to. So I suppose what I'm asking for commentary on is, how much work do you think it involves in order to get that buy-in from people? Because some people will pay more, and a pilot can't show that, and that there are sort of limitations to the pilot. Thank you.
Julie McLaughlin.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I know that Neil Craig will add to this in terms of the modelling that we did. I think just what I'm keen to state is that the modelling is for a national rollout of a CBI, and as you have rightly alluded to, there are limits to what you can test within a pilot. However, what you can do, as Neil Craig mentioned earlier, would be to get a better insight into the behavioural implications, how people react to receiving this money, which you could then use to inform your economic modelling. I think another point which is really important, and we discussed this in the report, is that a pilot would open up a debate around the needs or people's views on a basic income. We have done some work. I know that Fife Council and North Ayrshire Council have both looked through surveys of our communities, what their views are on a basic income. There are national surveys, European surveys and international surveys as well, which look at people's views. But I think what would be really important would be for that further debate on people's views on, for example, would you be willing to pay more tax for us to be able to roll out a universal basic income in those hypothetical questions. And again, I would come back to this debate on the need for a wellbeing economy, and not just focusing on measures like GDP. So I think that's important as well. But The public debate aspect is very important, and we do recommend in the report that further work is done on getting people's views on the feasibility of a basic income, and we hope that this report can be used as a good basis to start that conversation. But I know that Neil Craig will have more to add on the specific impact of the modelling as well.
I see we've got both Neil Craig and Andy wanting to comment on this. I'll take you both together, and I apologise for asking you to be a little bit briefer to let us get through it. So I'll take Neil first and then Andy.
I'll be very brief, and just to confirm with Ms McNeil's comment that yes, revenue neutrality is an assumption almost to make the modelling tractable. So we asked Fraser of Allender to model revenue neutrality simply because if you say there are no parameters within which they should do the model, then there are kind of infinite permutations of tax revenue raised through various forms of taxation, etc., etc. So it really was just a kind of rein in the analysis to say if it was set at that, if the payments were set at that level, with the savings, with the effects of the tax threshold, how much additional revenue needs to be raised, and how would that express itself in terms of changes in the income tax rate that would be required. But there's all sorts of different permutations that could be explored. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Andy White?
Sorry, it's covered by Neil. I don't want to take up any unnecessary time. Thanks.
Thanks, Andy. We'll move to Graham Simpson now.
Thanks, convener. I'll be really brief because we've covered a lot of ground. I just want to sort of make a comment on the affordability aspect of this. Covered it by Fraser of Allender. They of course produced a range of figures. One was 27 billion. It goes all the way up to 58 billion. And with extra tax of 8%, but going all the way up to 49%. So I can't see any government going for that. They'll be massively unpopular. Could I ask the panel to comment on a problem that I see, with the potential problem that I see of running a pilot project, is that some people will be in the pilot, some people won't be in the pilot. So if you take where I live in East Kilbride, we've got Hamilton down the road. If you were to run a pilot in Hamilton, then there are going to be some people in East Kilbride saying, why are those people in Hamilton getting this money and I'm not? Have you considered that?
Julie McLachlan.
Yeah, I'll try and be very brief. Yes, we absolutely have considered that. We don't propose a specific location for the pilots within the report. We say that we have to use an area that could be generalisable to the Scottish population. Of course, what we really want to test is the community level effects of a basic income. So what you have to do in order to do that is have a saturation pilot. You could look at other models, so you could just look at a specific area of the population. We did debate that, so that could be, for example, care leavers, lone parents, carers. However, what we were really interested in were those community level effects. So you would have to have a saturation pilot. However, we do fully recognise the issues with that. We do make comments on how people would be treated moving in and out of pilots as well. Just a brief comment on affordability. We recognise the challenge with that. As Neil said, we asked the Fraser of Allender to look at a specific model, and we've pointed out in the report you could look at other ways of funding a citizen's basic income, such as a wealth tax or a carbon tax, but we don't go into detail in those areas.
Before I take Neil Craig and Andy White, and who have both indicated they want to speak, I think given the time constraints, if you want to come back on that, Graham, it might be helpful to come back just now, and then either Neil or Andy can mop up some additional questions you might have.
I've only got one more question. I think my first question's been answered, if that's okay. My final question is, there was a pilot done in Finland, well publicised. As far as I know, the Finnish government has not taken that work forward. Why was that?
Who'd like to comment on that? I know Finland was mentioned during the opening statement, so Julie McLachlan. We'll just give that a second to see if we can get Julie McLachlan, who's muted at the moment.
Apologies, I was on mute there. Yes, that's correct. There was a pilot in Finland. It didn't test all of the principles of a universal basic income. It wasn't universal. It focused on those currently receiving benefits. It was really keen to test the labour market and outcomes. We could go into more detail on the findings of that. I think I alluded to them earlier, but I am conscious of time. What impacted the Finnish pilot? We had a visit to Finland funded by the Carnegie UK Trust, where we heard about the pilot. We spoke to other pilot areas as well. Was that there was an impact on the political feasibility of it, and the government decided to take a different approach during the pilot. So that had an impact on the findings as well. And I know that the current government there is not focusing on a basic income anymore. At least that's my understanding of the Finnish context.
Okay. Apologies to Neil Craig and Andy White for not taking you in there. Keith Brown to be followed by John Finney.
Thanks, Convener. Just a couple of points which would be useful to get the comments on of those involved in the report. First of all, I think Graham Simpson's point is quite an important one, and for that reason, I would imagine a pilot would be far better done across an entire local authority area, which oddly enough leads me to think that you're best to go to somewhere like Clackmannanshire, which is a small area, smallest mainland council, which happens to be my constituency, or somewhere like Inverclyde or Midlothian, again, very small councils. I think that would give you the benefits of the report stresses repeatedly, which is the local government buy-in, which is necessary in addition to the Holyrood and to the Westminster buy-in. The other point I was going to ask is whether the people involved in the report think that sufficient regard was had by themselves and by the Fraser Valander Institute to the other benefits, and whether 3 years is enough to see the other benefits. I'm talking about things like the reduction in child poverty, the reduction in inequality, the alleviation of pressure on health and other social services from those reductions. Now, they will take a bit of time to come through the system, but they should be advantages that would come out of some of the figures which are mentioned in the report in terms of the number of children coming out of poverty. Do they think that's being given sufficient? We've concentrated very much, and rightly, on the cost of it, but I'm not sure the benefits have been fully fleshed out.
Neil Craig.
It's the first one. The criteria for choosing the area to include in the study, would have to be finalised in that year's preparatory period. But it would just point out that even if it was a local authority, there will still be people living at the edges of local authorities who are living close to people who aren't, close to job opportunities in neighbouring areas that might encourage them to move in and out. So there will still be a boundary at some point around the study area which might affect the sorts of behaviours people engage in as a result of either receiving the CBI if they're in the study area or not receiving it were they to move out, which comes back to the prior discussion about how that would be managed. And we have given some thought to that, but it would require further refinement. One question is about whether you would continue to be eligible to receive the CBI if you moved into a neighbouring area that wasn't part of the pilot study. We suggest it should, so that it doesn't unduly influence the choices you make about taking up jobs elsewhere. But that would all need to be refined. In terms of the whether we attach enough weight to wider benefits, I mean, it partly was a pragmatic choice in terms of the length of period that the study would apply for. If we conducted a longer pilot, we would certainly see more of the potential consequences working through. Obviously, it would come at a cost, and might also mean that the study was more prone to some of the political changes that seem in Finland to have led to the termination of the pilots. We're very mindful about getting a duration where you are likely to see the full pilot worked through without making it such a long period that A, it was very costly, and B, it might become prone to political changes and a changing complexion of the government, who then decided not to continue the pilot and curtail the usefulness of the pilot. In terms of the other benefits that might have been included, were it rolled out on a national basis, again, I absolutely take the point that there are additional benefits to be considered. Again, it was largely a pragmatic choice to look at the macroeconomic consequences. The report is the macroeconomic modelling is very keen to make the point that it really is not a prediction about what will happen. It's an exploration of some of the parameters that will drive what will happen, and some of those parameters relate to how acceptable the CBI is to people and how that influences their subsequent response to the CBI. So if there were some of the additional benefits that you described there working through, then that might increase the acceptability of the CBI, which might change people's response to it. So it just becomes very difficult to keep defining potential knock-on implications and quantify them in a reliable way, because, if you like, the ripple effects are so complicated. But absolutely take the point that they are important things to consider, and we're very keen to make the point that defining impacts in terms of narrow parameters like GDP do need to be put in the context of a wider debate about a well-being economy and some of the other consequences that might flow from the creation of a CBI that can't be quantified with traditional models and traditional macroeconomic modelling approaches.
Keith?
Just very briefly, Convener, I'll not ask another question, but just to say, for those of us that are supportive of this and keen to see a pilot, which I have to say, given the Westminster Government set its face against it, seems unlikely. I think those things I mentioned, the health benefits, the benefits in reducing inequality, are the central purpose for advocating it in the first place. And it would be useful, if there is further work to be done, to try, and I know it's difficult, as has just been said, to try and quantify what those might be, because that, I think, is fundamental to the case for a UBI. That was just a comment, Convener.
Okay, thank you, Keith. That's now on the record. John Finney, welcome to the committee. I apologise, it's just how it turned out that you're the last member to come in. We're very pleased to have you here, and thank you for your patience, Mr. Finney.
No, thank you very much indeed, Convener, and thank to the panel for their hard work, their excellent work on this. Can I align myself with the comments about an unnecessary focus on GDP? I think we need to consider broader factors. I think, for instance, Oxfam's Humankind Index is something that could inform decisions about that. I had a question, and if I first say that in a report earlier this year from the Resolution Foundation, they said that the move to universal credit was a shock to families' living standards. Now, it seems to me that when you move from one system to another, the transitional arrangements are absolutely key to that. I wonder if the panel can say something briefly about the challenge of transitional arrangements, where it to be put in place, please.
Don't see any indication in the chat box as to who'd like to make an observation on that. Mr. Craig, thank you very much. Neil Craig.
Just very briefly, I mean, I think the very purpose of the year's preparatory period that Julie referred to earlier is to deal with some of these issues. So I can't give you chapter and verse on our deliberations about what all the different transitional challenges might be, but we're certainly conscious of them and recognised the importance of ensuring, partly to achieve no detriment and partly to make sure that logistically the scheme works properly and doesn't put people in difficult financial circumstances, that we would need a good preparatory period to make sure those transitional arrangements were fully considered. It relates to the issue of what happens when people move in and out of the area. It relates to people, what happens at the end of the period of the pilot and things like that, which also has ethical implications for carrying out the pilot and carrying out the evaluation, which we explore in some detail So I think there are unresolved questions there, but we actually absolutely acknowledge the importance of those questions, and that is one of the main reasons why a lengthy transitional preparatory period was proposed.
Many thanks indeed.
Mr. Finney, given you have had to actually wait quite a long time to ask your question, for all the difference in our 2 or 3 minutes the committee makes, is there a follow-up question that you would like?
Well, if I may, thank you very much, indeed, Convener. People have alluded to COVID. There's been reference made to the Finnish experience there. I just wonder if there's likely to be ongoing engagement on an international level, because there is much interest in this, and I think some surprising people are lending their support now to this concept that was in fairly recent times rubbished as impractical. So I wonder if there is any engagement out with Scotland.
Thank you, Mr. Finney. Julie McLachlan.
Thank you. Yes, we would be very keen to share the findings of the report, and we see that as a key area of next steps. As I mentioned earlier, the formal aspect of the feasibility study has concluded with the end of the funding, but we'd be really keen to share the findings of the report. I think in terms at a UK level, it is very in-depth. It's probably one of the most in-depth studies of a basic income in the UK. I'd mentioned previously our international learning visit to Finland for a Basic Income Earth Network conference, which was funded by the Carnegie Trust. As part of that, we produced an international learning report. When we were in Finland, there was significant interest in what's happening in Scotland. We presented at that stage our very early findings. This was at the very start of the feasibility study, but we welcome the opportunity to share findings further, and there is significant interest in the work that we are doing, and significant interest in Scotland and the feasibility of a citizen's basic income here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Finney. Thank you again for your patience. Just before I thank our witnesses for their time and efforts here today, I think every member has said before I've asked for a question, we're very appreciative of the significant work that you've all done in relation to this, and the nature of the questions. I think the committee's going to want an ongoing dialogue. Whether the best format for that is a formal scrutiny session, or we find another way to that conversation going. To work with yourselves, I think we're certainly thirstier for it, but we'll have to discuss as a committee how we take that forward. So can I thank all our witnesses for their time here this morning, and we now move to agenda item 4, which is actually consideration of the evidence that we've just heard, and we've previously agreed to take that in private. So just before we move into private session, can I say to MSPs before they go, we were going to take a short comfort break. I suggest that we don't do that, if that's okay, and I'll see you shortly on another platform to continue with those discussions. So thank you again to our witnesses, and we're going to move into private session. Thank you.